Hi everyone, I'm Chef Susie. Welcome to our live session today. Today we're going to be celebrating fall a little bit. We're going to be making an apple spice pull-apart bread. This is a technique that's pretty easy to make. I wanted to show you this. I chose the apple spice bread because of the season, but you can easily do this with a lot of variations, different flavors. So we'll kind of talk about that as we go along a little bit. But this is just a simple dough. It's an enriched dough, which is a dough that has eggs, sugar, butter in it. It's very rich. It's a little bit more of a softer dough and a little bit sweeter. So I'm just going to show you a basic dough today, and you can really use any enriched dough. If you perhaps have a favorite sweet roll or cinnamon roll dough, you can easily use this with this technique. And the pull apart bread is exactly as it says. It's a bread that you can easily pull apart. We're going to be making it in layers, quite easy. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so for the dough, it's really easy to make. You can make this on a machine, but I'm going to be making it by hand today, so bear with me a little bit. I have to stop to wash my hands every now and then. But first we're going to be making just a basic sponge. So I've got some warm milk, and I'm going to be adding just a little bit of my sugar, and this is just going to be a little bit of food for the yeast. We've got some active dry yeast, and we're going to go ahead and whisk this together. And then I'm going to be adding just a little bit of flour. And I always add a little bit of flour to my sponge, and that's what we're making. And it's just going to kind of help hold some of those bubbles a little bit. So I'm taking flour that is part of the measurement for the recipe. Okay. So this is a basic sponge. The yeast has some nice warm milk that it's dissolving in. It's got a little bit of sugar that's going to feed it. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this aside for about maybe 6 or 8 minutes. And we're just going to watch for this to bubble. It's going to become active. So we're going to go ahead and set this aside. And I did make a sponge earlier, just a little bit ago. And you can see that there was some bubbling. I have a little yeast here on the side that I forgot. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use this for the base for our dough. Okay, I'm going to switch this over to a bigger bowl. I can't really mix in this little one. Okay, so does anyone have any questions so far? So what we're going to be adding to this is the rest of the sugar. We've got an egg. The butter we're going to be adding melted, and I've got a little bit of salt, which I like to add at the end, because salt, when mixed together with yeast in the beginning, that could easily kill it. So I always keep it separate. I add it in when I'm adding my flour. So we're going to go ahead and add our butter and our egg and the rest of our sugar. Like I said, you can mix this on a machine, but I thought I would do it by hand today. Something different, because it's a small batch. And please let me know if you have any questions. Okay, so next we're going to be putting in our flour. All right, I'm just going to whisk a little bit of this in. I'm going to turn over to my spoon, and then we're going to put it on the board to finally finish it. We have some question. I didn't quite hear your question. Okay, I'm going to switch over to using my wooden spoon. And this is it's a pretty soft dough. It's not going to be real sticky, but we are going to be mindful about how much flour that we are adding. Like I said, it's just a very basic dough. I'm going to put my salt in. It's coming together nicely. And this is just enough for a small loaf pan. Okay, so it's coming together nicely. Any questions on our dough? As you can see, it's got a little bit of yellowness to it. And I'm just going to go ahead and fold in some of the remaining flour. And what's nice about making dough by hand, and I highly recommend it if you've only been making it on the mixer, you can really get a feel for it. And sometimes you really don't need all the flour, so you can kind of stop adding too, especially in the winter time when it's drier and your flour is drier. In the Midwest, where we are here, it's pretty dry in the winter because we have the heat running, so that really affects our ingredients. So I'm just kind of folding in some of this flour. We have a question. The question is, what kind of yeast did I use? I just used the Fleshman's active dry yeast, which I bought at the grocery store. And you're going to, once you open that, if you buy a jar, you're going to want to store it in the refrigerator, airtight, seal up that jar nicely. And you can also buy the envelopes, which is nice. And just always check the date, even when you're buying things new in the grocery store, especially yeast, check the date on it. And make sure you buy an active dry yeast. That's why we used it for the sponge, because it dissolved in the sponge. And instant yeast is more for, sometimes you might use that for the straight dough method, where you kind of pour everything in, almost like our focaccia assignment. And rapid rise yeasts are often used in bread machines. So they are typically made for that, to rise quickly, and I don't recommend interchanging your yeast. And the rapid rise yeast, that one can get a little exhausted, so you want to stay away from that. Okay, so our dough is looking great, nice and soft. It's a nice yellow and rich dough. Like I said, it's just enough for one batch. So what we're going to do with this is you're going to set it aside. You're going to let it ferment and double in size. And I have some dough that I made earlier that we're going to work on in just a bit. Okay, so in the meantime, we're going to get ready for our filling before we pull that dough out and start rolling it out. So do we have any questions on anything? Okay, so Chef Susie is going to take a minute to wash her hands. Okay, so like I said, with the making dough by hand, if you haven't done it outside of the mixer, I definitely recommend it. As you saw, pretty easy to do. Just take your time on your kneading. And we are going to go ahead and cut up some apples for the filling. So what we're going to be doing, I have just a Granny Smith apple, and what we are going to do is you can leave the skins on or you can take them off, and I like to take off my skins. Okay, so we're going to be using apples. You can use a variety of different kind of fruits to change up this bread a little bit. You can use pears, you can use dried fruits, perfect for this time of year. You could even add some savory items as well. And I think that you could do like a dried strawberry in the summer with a little bit of, if you wanted to do an herb, you could do maybe a little bit of tarragon or maybe some basil for kind of like a sweet and savory bread. But I definitely recommend exploring different flavors. So what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be cutting up some apple here. I didn't cut this up ahead of time, because as we all know, apples are going to brown on us. And also you can soak them in a little bit of lemon, but I thought that I would just kind of cut them while we're chatting here. So I'm just cutting these in squares. You don't have to do a perfect dice. It's going in for a filling. And also you can do thin slices, but I'm going to show you the technique, and we're going to be cutting the dough. And I have done these in slices before. They work out nicely, but I find that the squares or the dices are a little bit easier when you're cutting the dough. And I don't like to make mine too small. Some people make them pretty small. And I kind of like to have some bigger pieces, and I press them into the dough a little bit. Okay. So any questions on different fillings? Does anyone have any thoughts? I have a little bit of skin here, but I have a tendency to just ignore that and cut it up a little bit for a little bit of skin in there. Okay, so another thing to consider is maybe some pomegranate. So that's kind of nice too. Cranberries are great this time of year, so definitely explore some different flavors. Okay, so you probably won't want to use something really wet, like a wet fruit, like a fresh strawberry. Those have a lot of liquid to them, or an orange. You want to stay with something a little more solid, like an apple or a pear, or even some dried fruits. Okay, so we've got the apple ready, so let's go ahead and roll out our dough, and we're going to start the process of making the pull-apart bread. Okay, so I have some dough that I made earlier. It's nicely risen, and this dough is super easy to work with. Usually the enriched doughs they're softer, and we're just going to be rolling this in a rectangle, and this is going to be cut and assembled in the loaf pan, so you don't have to worry about making it too perfect in shape and size. So you'll kind of see when I start working on it a little bit. What I am mindful is of the thickness, so I just go a little bit thinner than 1/4 of an inch. And we have a question, maybe a couple questions, huh? Okay.
If you're using a stand mixer, is it the same steps and the same arrangement?
The question is if you're using a stand mixer, is it the same steps? Absolutely. What you can do when you're making a stand mixer, if you don't want to dirty a bunch of bowls, what you can do is just make your sponge right in your mixing bowl. Then you can go ahead, once you see some bubbling, some activity after, maybe 5, 6, 8 minutes, then go ahead and add your melted butter and your egg and your sugar and the rest of your ingredients, just as I did. But be careful with melted butter. Be careful that you're not making that too warm. You always want anything that comes into contact with yeast not to be much warmer than body temperature. You don't want to go really over like 105, 110 degrees. So if it feels hot to you, let it cool off a little bit so you don't damage your yeast. Okay, so we are ready to go. Just want to make sure that I don't have too much flour here. Can brush off a little bit of that. Sometimes it is a little warm in here, and I have a tendency to use a little bit more flour when it's warm, but you can brush it off or scrape it with your bench scraper off your table. Got another question? The question is, were the eggs room temperature? Yes, they were, because they were going into that mixture that was already a little warm at room temperature. And always in baking, you're going to have your eggs at room temperature. So you can pull them out for, well, depending on how warm your kitchen is, an hour or so before you start baking. If you forget, you can put the egg in the shell in a bowl of warm water, and that's going to easily warm it up. Okay, so we have another question. The question is, the flour that I'm using today is all-purpose flour. And you'll find different formulas, different recipes with different flours, ranging from pastry flour to bread flour. And don't interchange them. Always use what is on the recipe. And if it states flour, it typically means all-purpose flour. And that's what I'm using today. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish this off. Let's talk about our dough for a minute. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is I'm going to brush this with a little bit of egg wash. You can brush it with butter as well for some flavor. And then I'm going to be putting my apples on, and then some spiced sugar. So I'm just putting enough egg wash to kind of make this tacky so everything sticks. And like I said, you can use butter for some added flavor. It's just really a preference. Some people use butter, and sometimes I do use butter, or sometimes I'll use egg. I have a little bit of clumping on my egg here. It makes my egg wash all that well, so you want to kind of brush that in a little bit. Okay, so then what I typically do next is I'm going to put my apples in next, and just going to sprinkle them on top. Like I said, this is a filling, so you don't want like all of them on one side, but really you don't have to be too fussy, because they really are just going to bake into the bread. If you wanted to put a little bit more, then putting on here today, you definitely can go a little bit heavier on your apples. So what I do next is I kind of press them in a little bit. So I'm going to be cutting and stacking this dough. So this is kind of a fun thing to do, and it's a little random. Okay, so I've got some sugar here that I mixed some cinnamon in, and I put a little allspice and a little clove in here, and a little ginger as well. And you can do any combination that you like. You could just do straight cinnamon sugar. And as you can see, this is it's a little dark. I like to make mine a little bit darker, but you can make this lighter if you want. I kind of like that dark line. I like a lot of flavor, but you can lighten it up with a little extra sugar. You can be pretty creative with this filling, but like I said, just be careful you're not putting anything too wet in here. I mean, you could try it, but maybe take some notes on how much you're putting. Okay, do we have any questions on anything? We got a question.
Is it best to scald the milk before using it, or just use it regular?
The question is scalding the milk. I just used warm milk. I warmed it to 110 degrees right before we started, and it worked out just fine. Okay, so let's go ahead and cut this. So what we're going to do is we're going to be stacking this. So I usually do stacks of 6, and then I cut them. These bench scrapers are great. You can use a knife, and some of my apple pieces are a little big, and I'm just kind of cutting through them. And like I said, it's just something that you are going to be stacking. This is going to be kind of pressed into the pan, so really you don't have to get out your ruler unless you want to. So you can just kind of put it together. So what I'm going to do next is I just take these pieces of dough. Looks like I got a little sticking here. Another thing that the bench scraper is great for if you have any sticking. And I'm just going to be stacking them up on top of each other. So I recommend not making your dough too thick, because then you'll have some nice flavor. You'll have some nice lining of the cinnamon and the apples. Okay. Sometimes your top will get a little sticky on you. You could put a little flour on your hands and just kind of maneuver around it a little bit. This is one of these things that's, you know, kind of fun to do. Okay, so we're going to stack this next one. And this is just a, you know, a fun little technique to play around with. And you're going to get your hands a little dirty, but that's okay. Maybe I'll put a little more cinnamon sugar on this one. It's a little sticky. Okay, so now we've got a couple of stacks of our dough. Okay. So next we're going to do is we're going to cut these, and then we're going to be placing it in the pan, and that's going to give the bread its pull apart effect. This is just, like I said, this is a fun thing to do, and you see that you're going to have some nice layering. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put them in our pan. Now, the fun part, right? Okay. So it's super easy to make. I have a nonstick pan, and I've also I've greased it lightly. And what I'm going to be doing is just pressing these into the pan. And you can kind of press them in however you like. Just be mindful with your pan that you're going to want your dough to go I usually do this just a little bit more than halfway up to side. So you could make this in a round pan or a square pan, but just be mindful that your dough pieces are high enough. Okay, so as you can see, I'm just pushing these in. And if you find at the end you have a little bit of, you have a piece that's a little too big, or I've got a little gap over here. So what I'm going to do is just cut a little piece off of this one and fill my gap. So that's the fun thing about these pull aparts. You could kind of maneuver them around a little bit and press it in. You're going to see these nice lines, and it's going to have some great flavor. And it is a little bit on the rustic side, so you're going to expect that when you bake it. So this is the assembly of our pull-apart bread. So like I said, I'm about halfway up the pan, and what you're going to want to do is proof this again. So I'm going to cover it, leave it sit for about a half an hour or so, depending on how warm your kitchen is, and let it rise all the way up to the top. And then you're going to be baking it at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about in between 45 and maybe 55 minutes. Typically takes about 45 minutes, but everyone's oven is going to vary, so just keep an eye on it. So what you can do is you can bake it just like this, or you can put a little bit of egg wash on top before you bake it and a little bit of your spiced sugar mixture. So I usually don't egg wash in sugar until after it's proofed. So let's go ahead and take a look at a loaf that I made earlier, and then we're going to say our goodbyes. So if anyone has any questions on the pull-apart bread, be sure you're getting these in. Okay, so first we're going to clean up our board. These bench scrapers come in so handy. This, by the way, is one of my favorite tools. You can use it for so many things. So it's great for cleaning your bench. And you can have it at hand for cutting. And it's really great for releasing like sheet pans full of brownies going around the outside or any bar. So if you don't have one of these, I recommend them. They're inexpensive and you'll find that you're using it a lot. And we do have another question. The question is how do you know how tight to squeeze these in? Well, like I said, you're going to be putting them in so they're about halfway up the side of the pan. So if you have some higher pieces, you're going to want to press these in, because this is going to double in size in the pan. It's going to come up to the top, so you want to leave some room to grow. So if you find that they're real high, then just press them down a little bit. Okay, I hope that's helpful. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the bread that I made earlier. It's super delicious looking and it's got a nice color to it. So I did egg wash this before I baked it, and I put a little bit of cinnamon sugar on top. Cinnamon spiced sugar. So you can leave it plain and you can brush it with butter. That's going to give a softer top too. And if you wanted something a little more shiny, you could use an egg white like we did with the French bread. And keep in mind the sugars are limitless too. Remember when we did the raspberry and the blueberry sugar, where we took dehydrated fruits and we blended them in a blender with some sugar? That's an option for these pull-aparts as well. So it's really limitless, and they come out of the pan easy. They look really pretty, and your friends and family are going to be impressed with you when you make this. So it looks super beautiful. You can see the swirling of the layers, and then when you go to eat this, you can cut it or you can actually pull it apart. So this is our pull-apart bread for today. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.